Viewers like you make this program possible. Support your local PBS station.
The French Chef is made possible by a grant from Safeway stores.
Who would ever think that this circle of dough could ever puff itself up into this magnificent edifice? If it's French puff pastry, it can. You'll see it happen before your very own eyes today on The French Chef. Welcome to The French Chef. I'm Julia Child. Today we're doing puff pastry. It's the kind of pastry that one can do again and again and see again and again because it's one of the great pastries of all time, and you can do hundreds of things with it. You can make, for instance, patty shells, such as this little shell here for individual servings, or you can do a magnificent community shell like this, which is light as a feather. Just think of this shell served at your own table filled with lobsters and mushrooms and a lovely white wine sauce. And the reason puff pastry puffs, which is one thing you ought to know, is that it is hundreds and hundreds of very, very, very thin layers of dough, which are separated by very, very thin layers of butter. And when it goes into a 400-degree oven like this, in about 20 minutes it should puff, if it acts as it should, so we can see how it looks in 20 minutes. And now, the key to puff pastry is, of course, the dough and the flour that goes into the dough that makes all of these leaves. And we're going to do today, as nearly as possible, a classical French method of making puff pastry. And French, I'm going to have to talk a little bit about flour, I'm sorry. A lot of people don't know much about flour, but that is the key to puff pastries, what kind of flour you use, and there is a great difference in flours. Now, American all-purpose flour is hard wheat because it's very good for bread, because it's strong and it rises and it's elastic, and that's what you want for bread. Now, French all-purpose home flour is soft wheat, and the French do not ever make bread at home. They buy it ready baked 2 or 3 times a day, and what they use flour for is pastry dough, such as puff pastry, and their flour is soft wheat. But we can get soft wheat pastry flour here, and I'm going to tell you more about that later, but I want you to see how that we make the dough business. So I'm going to wrap myself up a little bit too so I don't get flour all over. And now we're going to use 3 3/4 cups of pastry flour, and then we're going to use 1 cup of all-purpose flour, and that makes, as near as I can figure it out, just about the same mixture as French flour. And when you're measuring flour, anytime you follow one of my recipes, sift your flour directly into the cup. As you know, there are lots of different ways of sifting and measuring flour, and this is the one I always use because I think it's the quickest. Sift it directly into the cup and then sweep it off, and that makes 1 cup of flour. And now, if you don't have pastry flour, you can use that new granular flour, which is an all-purpose flour, and I found that that makes the next best alternative to pastry flour. You use 3 cups of that. And then, along with your flour, you would use 6 tablespoons of butter. Now, this is a 1/4 pound of butter, or 8 tablespoons. And so if you make a mark for half, that's 4 tablespoons, and then another half of the half, that gives you your 6 tablespoons. And then you cut that up. This can't be exactly like the French method, because in the French method they don't need to put any dough or fat into their, any fat or butter into their dough, because it just doesn't need it. But I found that if you put some fat in, then you have a less brittle dough at the end, and that's what we want, is not only for the dough, the pastry to rise beautifully, but we want also to have a lovely tender quality. Now I'm mixing up the butter with the dough, and I'm using one of these pastry blenders, which I find very useful. It's just some little wires that are held together with a handle. And this is just exactly like making pie dough. And the reason the pastry blender is useful is that you don't want the butter to soften. And I want to get this mixed until the butter and the flour are like sort of a coarse meal. And now I'll go on a little bit more about the flour. Now, the pastry flour is made out of soft wheat, and it's unbleached soft wheat flour, and it has no relation to cake flour. Cake flour comes in a box, and it's bleached and very, very finely ground, and it is for cakes. Pastry flour comes from just the soft wheat, and it does not have that rubbery or elastic quality that all-purpose flour has, and that's really the underlying difficulty in making puff pastry in this country, is that when you're using all-purpose flour, because the puff pastry needs an awful lot of rolling and folding and rolling out again, because of the gluten in the hard wheat flour, the dough becomes so rubbery that you just can't roll it out. And then a lot of people think, oh, gee whiz, I just can't make puff pastry. And it mainly is because you are using that difficult to handle all-purpose flour. So if you do use all-purpose flour, using this new granular flour, you just have to let it rest between your various rolls. And as we go along with the pastry, I'll tell you when you have to rest it. And now you can get pastry flour, if you're living in New England, through S.S. Pierce companies called Silver Flake, or you can get the King Arthur Round Table flour. And in the New York and Philadelphia area, you can order it from the Great Valley Mills in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. So, and I'll give you the proportions again. That's 3 3/4 cups of pastry flour and 1 cup of all-purpose flour, or 3 cups of the new granular all-purpose flour. The granular flour is much heavier, so it takes more. And then 6 tablespoons of butter. And then when you get that all beaten, all worked together like a fine meal, then you add 2 tablespoons of salt to 3/4 cup of cold water and stir that around. That's 2 tablespoons salt, 3/4 cup of cold water, and then you mix that in with a rubber spatula. See, this is just like making a pie dough. And then you're always going to need a little tiny bit more water, which you'll add by just about tablespoonfuls, because we want a firm dough which is going to hold its shape. And this first part of making the dough, this is called a détente. And this is a very important part of the making of the pastry, because you want to be sure that the dough is firm but not damp. So after you mix in some of your water, then you take it out and you push the dough together with your hands. And if you find that you need more water, you then add a little more water to your bowl. And you want to make a nice, firm but not damp dough. And then push it out like that, and then you want to let it rest with pastry flour for half an hour, and if you're using granular all-purpose flour, let it rest for an hour. And you'll find that this is much easier if you let this dough rest before you use it and put it in the refrigerator. Now I've got one that I have sitting on ice here, and you'll see how that looks. that I've had wrapped up. You can, if you've made an awful lot of this puff pastry before, you can immediately make your dough and then wrap it up with your butter and continue. But I found that it works much more satisfactorily if you let this dough rest so that it's hardened up, and then you want to roll it out to about a 9-inch circle. Just roll it all sides. Now this is about to be the leaf that's going to hold our butter. Now I'm going to get 2 sticks of butter, and this is hard butter, and that we have to soften up, but not too much. Now this is your second very important part, is this is hard butter, and I'm using unsalted butter because it's a little firmer. So you want to break it up a little bit to start softening it. And then very often, say if you're not using unsalted butter, you may find it's a little damp. So take a slightly dampened towel and just push it around in the towel, and that will get rid of some of the extra water, and it will also soften the butter up. You have to have the butter they call cool but malleable, because we're going to start rolling out this dough, and we have to have the butter form a regular leaf along with it, as you'll see now. Now form your butter into about a 5.5-inch package. I'm using here one of these putty knives. I just got it at my hardware store, and it's very useful when you're doing pastry. Then put your butter right in the dough, and then fold the dough up over the butter. And be sure when you're folding it up and making this package that you don't squeeze up on the sides, because you want the sides to be just as thick as the bottom. So now we have 2 layers. You see there's a dough on the bottom and dough on the top and the butter in the middle. And now we're going to roll it out into a rectangle. And you can see why you're careful about the butter, because if your butter was hard and lumpy, you'd not be able to, when you roll it out into the rectangle, have the butter follow right through underneath the dough. Now see, I'm rolling this very carefully, and you've got to keep it absolutely in the rectangle shape. And you want to roll it out to about 16 inches by about 7 inches. And then fold it up just as though you were folding up a letter, very evenly. Just stretch it out a little bit like that. And then roll over the other side. And then you roll it right out again into a rectangle and fold it. And then you wrap it up. And after you've made your 2 rolls, these are called rolls, you take your fingers like that and make a little mark like that, which would show you how many rolls you've done, because sometimes you forget. And then wrap it up securely and put it in a little plastic bag or into a damp towel and refrigerate it. And if you're using pastry flour, refrigerate it for half an hour. And if you're using that granular all-purpose flour, refrigerate it for about an hour. And then you have to have 6 rolls in all. So you would do 2 rolls and then wait, let it rest, and then you do 2 more rolls and let it rest. And those 2 rolls you should do really as soon as you can, either between half an hour and an hour, because you want your butter really to get rolling out and thin, otherwise it'll lump up. And then you do your final 2 rolls, which makes 6 in all. And then after you've made your 6 rolls, see, I've got little fingerprints here, you are then ready to go ahead and make whatever you're going to make with your pastry and roll it out. Now, remember that if you're using the all-purpose flour, you'll have to let it rest for at least 2 hours after your 6th roll, and overnight is even better. And now I'm going to roll it out. I want to show you a new rolling pin I got when we were in France last time. And this one has little ridges running all along, and it's been made especially for puff pastry because it just seems to, you can roll out much more easily, and particularly when you're making your rolls, it distributes the butter more easily. And this is the real rollout, so I can just give it a start this way, and then I'll continue with another rolling pin. But particularly if your pastry is rather hard, it starts it out nicely. Now when you're doing your rolling, be sure to scrape things up. This is a French pastry scraper, because if you've got a lot of sort of butter and things on the bottom of your board or your marble, it makes it hard to roll and it can stick. And then, now here's another rolling pin. I always like to show this rolling pin because it's so ridiculous. But it makes it very hard to do, and you couldn't roll it that way because the pin's too small. And here's a professional pastry one, which I like the best of all because it's good and hard, good and heavy. Now I'm going to roll this out to about 1/4 of an inch. And then we're going to make that big vol au vent. So when you make one of these big patty shells, the best way to make it is in 3 layers, then it will rise properly. And these are French pastry cutters, which are very convenient because you can just put them on and lift them off, and they come in 12 different sizes. If you don't have one of those, use something, a plate, or use one of these molds, anything that'll give you an even cut. Now this is going to be a 7-inch patty shell. And so you want to be sure when you're cutting your circle, leave a little bit, about 1/2 inch on each side, because all of your layers, and there are 730 layers of dough between the butter and this piece here, and the layers around the edge may not be absolutely even, so you don't want to cut right up to the edge. And making something like one of these big vol au vents is a fairly luxurious thing because you're using so much dough. Now we make our second cut here. And then the second layer is just is a circle, rather like a donut. So, and this is a 5-inch cutter here. I want about 3/4 of an inch as the circle. And then we're going to put it, I'm going to put it on a pastry plaque. And the pastry plaque is a wet one. And you want it wet because you want your dough to grip on the plaque so it'll have sort of a footing to rise on. Now I'm going to put the first circle on. So just fold it in half this way. And then put it on upside down because you'll have less flour on the bottom than you would on the top. So that lies there. Then the circle goes on top of that. And be sure, if you're just starting out on puff pastry, don't try to do it on a hot day or in a very hot kitchen, because you'll have a very difficult time with it because the pastry gets so soft. If it is hot and you find that the pastry's softening up, immediately put everything that you haven't rolled, just have a big platter or something and stick it right in the refrigerator, because it's just impossible to work when it becomes soft. Now there's our circle. You see I wet the edge of that, and now we have the circle on that. And then this small circle here is going to be the top. So that you just roll out. And if you're using all-purpose dough, you may find that this rollout is a little difficult, so you can just put everything in the refrigerator and let the all-purpose dough rest. That seems to be the secret in all-purpose dough, is a good rest, and then you can work with it. With a pastry dough, you don't have trouble. Now I'm going to cut this out again to the 7-inch. tried making these vol au vents just in one layer, and it just doesn't work out as well. They don't rise as evenly nor as high. Now this circle gets painted again with water, and then you want to prick the bottom of it because we want to keep the inside portion from rising so much. So that's pricked right straight through to the pastry plaque. And then, oh, here's my top one. I was losing track of it. And now the top goes on. And then press that down with your finger, and then we're going to seal the edges take the back of a knife and put your finger on and just push together. You see, that makes a little push together of all three of those layers. And this is very important because if you don't get them pushed together, they may split out apart as they cook. It also makes a pretty little decoration. You just go click, click, click right around very quickly. Be sure that you get the whole part of it. And then that gets painted with beaten egg, and you paint just the top of it. And this is going to give a nice brown glaze to it. And really, beaten egg is the only way to get a professional glaze. If you use anything else, well, people say, oh, use milk and sugar or something like that. It's never going to look properly. And then take another little knife and you make a little designs like this in your egg glaze. And this you only do at the last moment. And also, it's best because as soon as this pastry gets into the oven, gives it a big seize and it starts cooking. The best thing is after you have made this, put it then in the refrigerator covered with wax paper and a damp towel and let it rest for an hour. And if you're making using all-purpose flour, let it rest for 2 hours, because you notice with the all-purpose and that sort of rubbery quality that it has, if you've made this and put it directly into the oven, then it becomes rubbery and it will lose its shape. And now out of our leftover pastry, and you may find if you haven't worked very fast that you would have put this into the refrigerator before you try making your little patty shells with it, because it may become so soft that it's difficult to work. Now here's a 4-inch cutter, and these again are much better if they're, say, 2 layers rather than 1. There's the 4-inch cutter. Now we have a 2-inch one for the inside. And then you again put that, I'll say that is our wet pastry plaque, and then you paint it, and then you put your circle on, and then you poke it all the way down to the pastry plaque, and then you paint it. Now in this case we don't need the top on it, but having the 2 layers gives you a very nice side so that it rises up very nicely. And this little piece you can roll out again and use again as a much smaller bouchée, or you can cook it just like that. But if it's fairly high like this, you'll find that it will it may puff up and then fall over. This again, after you've got your 2 layers on here, you do this same business with your knife. And again, you're going to have much better luck with all of these things if you let them rest in the refrigerator for about an hour. Particularly, again, as I will say, with the all-purpose flour. It's not so necessary with the pastry flour. So that is the one reason that I wanted to talk to you about the pastry flour, because it makes the whole business of puff pastry so much easier to make. Because with your all-purpose, with that continual long rest that's necessary, you cannot make it in one day, and just don't try to make it in one day. You just have to have, and particularly if you're just beginning with it, take your time with puff pastry, and then you'll find that it works out perfectly well. Drop my glasses again, there. And when you have you can also freeze one of these vol au vents after you've made it, but before you've glazed it, put it on a flat thing and wrap it up and put it right in the oven. I mean, put it in the freezer and then take it right from the freezer into the oven. Now these all start out, either the big ones or the little ones, in a 400-degree oven. And then look, now this is the one we just put in at the beginning. See, that has puffed up very nicely, and it's begun to brown. I'll move this out a little more so you can see. But you see, it's still very delicate. And after it's been in for 20 minutes, you then turn the oven down to 350 and let it cook for another probably 30 minutes. Now I've got some here that have cooked just like that one and have been in the warming oven, and I hope that they're going to be the way they should be, because we have another important part of it to show you. Now there's your great big one, all done, and this is very much like the cream puff shell, an enormous one. There's a lot of uncooked stuff, uncooked pastry in the middle of it. So you take a knife and cut off your cover. There, that hadn't dried out too much. Now this is typical. You see, you have this uncooked pastry here, so you just take a fork and scrape it out. This is why I think these vol au vents always are so expensive, because you have all of this pastry that is uncooked and unusable. Then when you scrape all of this out, then put them back into the oven, both undone, for about 10 minutes, and let them dry out, and then they're ready to use. And for the patty shell, you clean out the patty shell in exactly the same way. Now, I'm going to fill this shell, and we're going to use a lovely mixture of lobster and mushrooms in a beautiful sauce. And now you would fill this only just at the last minute, because if you filled it ahead, it would get a little bit soggy. So you have your mixture all ready, and then you put your top back on. Now, the only way to learn how to make puff pastry is just to go ahead and make it. It's as light as a feather, and it's a real feather in your culinary cap if you can make it. So that's all for today on The French Chef. This is Julia Child. Bon appétit.
Julia Child is co-author of the book Mastering the Art of French Cooking.